But every generation inherits a map, and we rarely question it. And we assume that because we have these Bibles with these maps in them, that those maps are where the Bible actually fits. But yet when archaeologists get right at it and they dig, and they find there are no walls of Jericho, and there are no Nazareth at the right time, there's no lake the size that meets the needs of the lake that Jesus describes with the mountainous waves. When you start looking at the Bible itself, it doesn't always fit. There's lots of things that don't fit. And so the scholars tend to go the route of, well, they made up myths and stories to make the people look great. So David and Solomon and Moses and a lot of that stuff is myth to scholars because they can't show in the ground with archaeology that it ever happened where the maps said it should be. But the question that scholars generally and people we just don't ask is, if we read the text, would we read it differently? And would we map it in our minds different? We expect different things. When we read of lions and crocodiles and apes and ostriches, would we be looking in one certain area or we might consider another? And why would that be? Because when we go and excavate, let's say, modern Jerusalem or Jericho or Capernaum or whatever it is, when we go and dig up what is there, it's not that there weren't any settlements, but when the settlements that there don't match at all, and there's no coinage for 1,000 years of Israel's history, there's no coinage found in the ground, the expectations start to go, and as the scholars have said, they start to see it more as myth. In order to keep the Bible in the maps we have to make the Bible myth, rather than thinking maybe the maps are myth and the Bible is accurate. And that's where I want to go with this. So I want to talk about the Exodus and dealing with the Yam Suf question for a second. And it says in Exodus 13:17, God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines, although that was near. And this line alone tells us that the Philistines controlled a major coastal or river coastal corridor. They were militarized and unavoidable if they went a certain direction, and Moses deliberately avoided going that direction. Oftentimes we're told that the Philistines were on the Mediterranean, but if they were put where we tend to have put them, it doesn't make a lot of sense since that was Egyptian land, and the Philistines being a large, major people, powerful people that would make Moses with 1 million people fear going that way. It doesn't make a lot of logical sense. So we could maybe consider that they were on the Red Sea, further down, slightly south along the between the Nile River and the Red Sea, and living in what would be Eritrea area now. But to avoid the Philistines, the Israelites went west. I want to make the point, I've done videos on this. They went across the Yam Suf. And so the word Yam Suf, which has been translated as the Red Sea, is actually better translated from the Hebrew into meaning sea of reeds. And since the Red Sea has no reeds or papyrus, it doesn't work very well. So the Red Sea is a poor translation. It actually has to be a freshwater body that they crossed because that has reeds. Thus, it would be called the Sea of Reeds, or a large body of water that had reeds, which would be the Nile River or its tributaries. So they crossed the Yam Suf, or the Nile River, in my opinion, and went across the Nile, heading what we would call west from Egypt. Probably along where we have the modern Aswan or Aswan Dam, and into sparsely populated wilderness, which would have been west of Egypt. It's very important to understand that in 3,000 years ago, it wasn't dry sand Sahara Desert. It was more like grasslands with rivers here and there. It was there weren't a lot of people living there, but it wasn't the landscape we see in the Sahara any longer now. It was quite different. It was more of a grasslands area. So when they took their cattle and their land and their people across and spent 40 years in the wilderness, they actually had their animals could survive, as with their camels and all those things. But the people would have had nothing to live on really if they're traveling all the time. So they were given manna from heaven. And we notice too that there isn't a lot of talk in the scriptures about miraculous water being either healed or found. There's a couple of times when they talk about the water, but the manna is daily except on the Sabbath day. But the manna is continual for 40 years, whereas the water must have been there because they don't mention it. And what we consider the Sinai Desert today, east of Egypt, there's basically no water, certainly not enough water to sustain 1 million or 2 million people. So why did they take a detour, right? Why didn't they go, if they wanted to go south down into the lands where Abraham came from, because it says in the scriptures that Abraham went south when he went out of Egypt with Lot and his wife. So if they went south, that's where they were headed. Why didn't they go south along the east side of the Nile River? Well, probably that's, in my opinion, where the Philistines might have been. Who knows? I have no proof of that, but that would make sense that the Philistines controlled the coastal area. So they had to make a detour into the wilderness. So Numbers 13 to 14 shows that the spies returned with fear. So they went into the wilderness. They went traveling down towards the south where they wanted to go, along established trade routes of the day, down towards where Sudan is today. They would have gone down that way. But when they were starting to go in where they would have been peopled areas, then they would have had to go to war. And Moses sent in the spies, as we know, and they all came back fearing except for Joshua and Caleb, who reported that it was a land flowing with milk and honey, as was reported. But the others came back fearing, and so Moses had the people spend 40 years more in the wilderness because they weren't ready to go in. They weren't prepared for the battles and the troubles that would come. So the solution in the text is 40 years of wandering in what was then what I can call the Sahel-like grasslands, what would be Mali, Niger, that area along North Africa, not on the coast, but down where the Sahara is now, was grasslands 3,000 years ago. It had sparse human settlements, so no major conflicts. They didn't have to be in conflict with anybody. Plenty of water and forage for the herds and flocks, which is in Numbers 21. The humans relied on manna, showing they could not yet subsist fully on the land as they were traveling and moving about. And miraculous water sources were rare but sufficient. So yes, water is mentioned a couple of times, but they didn't need it mentioned all the time. They didn't need miracles all the time for water. This wandering was preparation and not just punishment alone. It was preparation to prepare the people, the younger generation that survived, so that they were ready to obey God or obey their leaders and go in and take the land which God had given them. The next section I'm going to do is on entering the land of milk and honey, because after 40 years, Israel moves south into the land of promise to their ancestors, the land flowing with milk and honey. And this is a key expression. I've done a video just on this, but I'll go over this just quickly. In Exodus 3:8, what does this mean? Milk. It means land rich enough for large herds, for cattle and goats and sheep. Honey means abundant enough vegetation for bees and native honey sources. Valleys and water sources to sustain millions of people and their livestock. 3,000 years ago, the Levant, or what we call modern Israel, could not satisfy this description for millions of people as a land of milk, flowing with milk and honey. It was narrow, rocky terrain. It had seasonal streams and small valleys and one small river system. Sparse pastures, sparse grass, and few areas large enough to support armies or even tribal herds. That's why I think when they study and they do the archaeology in what we call Jerusalem today, they find that it was a village of 700 to 1,000 people. The land could support that, but it couldn't support millions that are talked about in the Bible. By contrast, the African corridor, what we call the Sahara today, which is the Sahel and the Nile, from the Nile onward, the Nile River valleys, and further south, they're fertile with grasslands for herds. That's why there's so many, gazelles and zebras and all the different animals that we see mentioned in the Bible, but also what we see in Africa today with all the carnivores that go with it. The rivers and springs that are mentioned in the Bible for settlements to be able to survive, and enough room for tribal territories, multiple nations, and sustained conflict. The next section I want to talk about is that the world of the Bible is full of peoples. Israel after they leave the wilderness is never alone, not for one single generation, not even probably for 5 or 10 years. We read about, in Numbers, we read about Moab and the Moabites, like Ruth. We read about Ammon in Judges. We read about Amalek in Exodus. We read about Midian in Numbers, and Philistines in Exodus, and the Canaanites all the time in Numbers all the way through. The Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites in Genesis. The Arameans, the Cushites, as Moses married a Cushite woman. So these are political entities or nations that live around the 12 tribes. They're not just poetic, they're not just mythical in the Bible. They are real peoples that engage in real war, real trade, real alliances, and real migration. And the Bible is clear in describing many conflicts, not just conflicts that one, and then 100 years goes by, another conflict. No, it's conflict. And many of the conflicts are overlapping. So they're not just isolated incidents, they're all the time continual. So one war basically doesn't end until another is starting or they're going on at the same time. And scale is important. Just look at the size of the Levant and consider all these different nations that I just read about. We're talking nations, not one little village with 1,000 people. We're talking nations. Whether it's the Moabites or Amalek or Hittites or the Canaanites, these are nations. To give an example, the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan, all had their tribes. They all grew into great peoples. And look at the size of Cush, and look at the size of Mizraim, and the whole Libya, North Africa area of Put. These are great peoples. So the Canaanites were a great people in numbers as well. By the time Moses is coming down into the land, he's not just conquering villages of 100 people and 200 people. These are large groups of people entrenched in the land, which is why the Jericho and the walls of Jericho are so key and described when Joshua goes and takes over that city. It had to be a decent-sized village because the walls couldn't just be breached easily. They had to go around them for 7 days and the walls fell in. But where we place modern Jericho on our maps today, they've dug there and there are no walls for the time. And certainly not the walls that were talked about in the Bible. So the Bible describes scale, large people, large groups, large lands, large mountains, large rivers, large everything. And the names and these peoples and these armies don't clash in a teeny little land just north of Egypt. They clash in a large area because they're coming from all different sides. And the text assumes, and if you read the text, and you have, it assumes great space exists for these armies to come and go, and for David to lead his armies out here and there. It's a grand scale, not a teeny little dry strip with a few hills. So moving past the continuous conflict, we also want to look at the geography as well, because the Bible doesn't just talk about a few skirmishes like with Moab or the Canaanites, like I said. It talks about large rivers large enough for permanent settlements and crossings, lakes capable of navigation and storms, like in Mark 4, where they're mountainous waves. The lake that we call the Sea of Galilee today can never get mountainous waves. It's not big enough, not even by a half, not even by a tenth. It's not big enough to have mountainous waves. It can have 6 foot, 7 foot waves in a storm. We're talking mountainous waves that make fishermen fear. So it has to have large lakes. It has to have mountains suitable to be not just be tribal territories and be talked about, but to be idolized and worshipped. Large mountains are described in the Bible and in the Apocrypha. The Levant, or modern Israel area, or Palestine, is narrow and compressed, and it cannot support all these simultaneous wars and populations, much less just the population of David with its millions. It can't support it, much less all the people that were supposed to be around the same area. Whereas the African corridor could easily do so without, by far. And of course I'll show some maps here to show the difference in scale. The Bible talks a lot about riches and resources and the environment itself. So the Bible expects or lends support to millions of people, vast herds for the tribes that they live off of, gold and silver and trade goods. We read about this, of course, with Solomon and David. Huge, vast amounts of gold and silver, multiple neighboring nations, of course, and armies, lakes and rivers, mountains, fertile valleys, and deserts. In Genesis 2, we also read about 4 rivers flowing from Eden. And we read in Numbers about water, sources for the flocks. In Exodus, we read about springs and bitter waters, of course, which we've mentioned. Without enough land, water, and forage, the numbers, armies, and trade described cannot exist. The land of milk and honey is not just metaphor, it's reality. It is a land large enough, fertile enough, and complex enough to host the world described in the text of the Bible. Another key point that we just don't consider enough. We know, and if you've looked into it, that Egypt hardly records at all after Moses. Actually, don't even record anything to do with Moses. But there's no record of Egypt dealing with David or Solomon for 1,000 years to have the Levant be the Holy Land, 150 to 200 miles from Egypt, the center of Egypt. And they're never mentioned in any wars, no trade disputes, no cultural pressure one way or the other. Only thing we see in the Bible once in a while are distant alliances to when the people want protection from Babylon or Assyria. But we don't see anything to do with Egypt at all, which goes back to Exodus where Moses said, "And you will see them no more," meaning the Egyptians. Because after leaving Egypt, this superpower, a huge nation, it disappears from the narrative. It's not just a little bit. It's gone from the narratives because who is Israel fighting? It's fighting the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Hittites and the Canaanites. It's not fighting the Egyptians. Never. You don't see them fighting Egypt. Yet if they were living supposedly 150 miles away for 1,000 years, you'd expect to see something. And Egypt never, in their own records, nor in the Bible, is there any mention either way of this bond or these peoples living close by and knowing one another. So if Israel were only 150 to 200 miles away, as I said, which it is, and Jerusalem today from Egypt, that's the Levant model, this silence between Egypt and Israel, or the 12 tribes, it's illogical completely, this dead silence. Forget finding any coins in the ground and all that kind of stuff. Just the silence, because the Egyptians kept very good records, and there's just silence. There's nothing about any people living where Jerusalem is today, calling themselves the 12 tribes and Solomon and David and all that type of thing. So in the African corridor model, it makes perfect sense. If they went down through Sudan, down into Kenya, Uganda area, where the Great Lakes, like Victoria, and the mountains like Mount Kenya, if they went there, they're far enough away from Egypt that they would have nothing to do with Egypt at all. They weren't even going to be their direct neighbor. So if we let the text speak, rather than the maps that have been made by man, the text speak. When scholars and archaeologists say the Bible is exaggerated or mythic, you just go anywhere on YouTube and you see scholars and archaeologists and reports about how the Bible is exaggerated or mythic or these people didn't really exist. Maybe the problem isn't that the Bible didn't exist and these people didn't exist. Maybe the problem is the land, the map that's been made. The map that's been made isn't the real place. If that's the case, then the text can come alive. The maps can go away, but the text can come alive. But if we start like today, and almost all scholars do, almost all of us do, I did, we all do, right? If we think that Jerusalem and modern Israel, that area in Palestine and the Levant, if we think that that is the Holy Land of Jesus and the Holy Land of David and Solomon and Moses, and it doesn't work out, we can just lose our faith. We can lose, as they dig up these places and none of them work, and I mean almost none of them work, well, probably they don't. As I said, I made a video about Helena of Rome, how she named all the places 300 years after Christ. She went to the land that they owned, the Romans had control of. She went there and made, in my opinion, a holy land. Just like Rome made a church from the original, they made a new church. I think they also made a new holy land. So they could have pilgrimages to a land they controlled, which was close by. And she just named the places and made the Roman forts and the Roman things. And the old settlements fit the narrative that was in the Bible. But as the archaeology of our day speaks from the ground, because they're digging up these places, and they find, as I said, that Jerusalem with 700 people to 1,000 people. And think about it, Solomon was supposed to have had 1,000 wives and concubines, much less the city and the palaces and all of that. It doesn't fit. So when they come upon that problem, scholars and our generation have gone to, well, it's just a myth. They just made that stuff up. Yes, there was a Solomon, probably. He was a chieftain over 700 people, that kind of thing. That's how they have to go, because that's what the ground tells them. But if they're looking in the wrong ground, they're just digging up the ruins of whatever. But if they actually went to the right place where the Bible text matches the actual land, and actually dug there, which has never happened, of course, in Uganda, Kenya, even the Meroe. I'll show some pictures here of Meroe, where there's as many, it's a Nubian type area down south of Egypt. There's as much ruins there, or as many ruins there as there are in Egypt, yet it's hardly been touched. Zimbabwe, there's great ruins there, it's hardly been touched. Because of colonial powers, we just have not touched Africa at all with the blade of a shovel. So it's just undiscovered territory. So we can't prove the Bible was ever there, but we certainly can look at the Levant and prove that by just logic and looking at what's in the Bible versus what they find in the ground, that the Levant, I'm afraid, is a very poor fit. So we have to look at the text and let the text speak for itself. That's my opinion. Because once we do, then we can start to try to open our eyes to see where the true land of Jesus, of Solomon, of David, of Moses, of Abraham, where was that land? Where might it have really been? And then we might be able to free the shackles from the Bible and let the Bible text speak for itself about the grandeur of the great events that happened in the Bible and the millions and millions of people living in tribes and animals of the Bible, the lions and leopards and gazelles and apes that are mentioned in the Bible can come to life rather than thinking they had a zoo in Jerusalem. We could have had a real Bible experience on other lands. And it's just something for you to think about. I'm going to leave a couple other videos that I've done here if you want to link to any of those. Anyway, thanks for joining me and have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.